Hi, my name's Dee. I'm the founder of Mint, and I'm joined again by Zoe Lloyd-Potter. So we're just going to film the fourth part of this series of male hormones. So we will have covered things like diet, sex drive, hair loss, nutrition, that kind of thing in the previous parts. But today, the fourth part is specifically talking about male hormones and mental health. So Zoe, in part one, we covered the basics of hormones, of male hormones. So you talked us through the main hormones that are responsible for lots of different things when it comes to diet, when it comes to sex drive, hair loss, various different health issues and things as well. So could you maybe tell us a bit more about what are the main hormones that affect mental health?
Yes, certainly. Well, first of all, as we all know, mental health is multifactorial. And the start of somebody's progression to worsening mental health, and that could be depression, anxiety, PTSD, we all know could be a major stressful event, a trauma. And that happens in some cases. But we also have people who they kind of feel, I was always boring. I've always had a bit of a low mood. You know, you can't pinpoint it down to a particularly stressful event. So there are many, many pieces to the pie. And I think the great thing about the facilities we have now for testing all of the different things that can cause this a decline in somebody's mental health has made us, be able to target our medications, to target our nutrition, to target our lifestyle, to try and mitigate, if you like, all of those, what I call pieces of the pie that can impact. Now, for some people, the major impact may be the stress and trauma. For some people, the major impact may be genetics. For some people, the major impact may be poor lifestyle. And for others, it's actually a bit of all of those pieces of the pie that have actually tipped somebody over the edge or made their condition worse. So I think let's just quickly talk about what we mean by a hormone. And then another variant of hormone, which we call a neurotransmitter, and what we actually really mean by that. So a hormone is a chemical substance that's produced in the gland. And we talked in previous videos about the hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid, adrenals. These are all glands that produce hormones. And they work on like a feedback mechanism, which is usually a negative feedback mechanism. So we go, oh, thyroid, send out a little chemical messenger to the body. How's your thyroid looking? Oh my God, no, the levels are dropping low. Great, let's produce some more. So it kind of works on that feedback mechanism. It's very, very clever. And a neurotransmitter is also a chemical messenger, but it's more delivered from the nerve cell. So again, it targets our muscles and it targets our glands, and it targets our other nerves. So all of these kind of, they all are responsible and can play into our mental health, anxiety, depression, and how that declines or how we feel on a day-to-day basis. So there was an initial theory of depression, which was called the monoamine hypothesis of depression, was that all depression was caused by low levels of things like, you've heard, serotonin, dopamine, and acetylcholine. Now, these are classical neurotransmitters, and it was thought that always depression was as a result of a low level of this in the body, and that's why there was a big surge in what we call the SSRI drugs, which were designed to increase something like serotonin. And people have actually found that they don't always work. They work in some people, and they actually have no effect in others, or they have a placebo effect. So, so when we look at stress, let's take stress as the starting point. And we look at how that affects the hormones. Well, we know, as we discussed in previous videos, that raises our cortisol level. And cortisol then downregulates if it stays high for too long, because we know cortisol is a good thing in the short term. It's an anti-inflammatory hormone, vital for life. But if we're chronically stressed and in chronically high state of cortisol, the body down-regulates it, because it's like, oh my God, if I've got cortisol, too much cortisol in the brain all the time, it's affecting the neurons in the brain. And so the brain will go, I need to down-regulate cortisol. And that can lead to chronic fatigue, because all of a sudden you can't even get out of bed in the morning. That will then down-regulate the sex hormones. So if you look at a male, that will have an impact on the testosterone. And if you look at the female, it will have an impact on estrogen and also progesterone. So again, you start off with one stress that causes an effect on one hormone that then down-regulates another. So you're already starting to get a bit of a cascade going sort of down the slippery slope. What also happens is that if we have high cortisol, it down-regulates, again, chronic cortisol we're talking about here, chronically high cortisol, down-regulates dopamine and serotonin. So what is dopamine? Well, dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and it's part of our reward and motivation part of our system. So we all know, you put a post on Facebook and you get nice responses, and that gives you that nice reward dopamine hit. When we eat sweet food, we get that dopamine response because it's it makes us feel good. In the short term, it makes us feel good. So when we look at the neurotransmitters, we've actually got two different types. We've got neurotransmitters that make us excited and successful and motivated. And we've got neurotransmitters that make us calm and relaxed. And we actually need, just like our sex hormones, just like cortisol, just like everything else in our life, we want a nice balance between the two. So dopamine is actually an excitatory hormone because it makes us feel good. It makes us want to get out there. And serotonin is actually a inhibitory neurotransmitter. So it kind of makes us feel more relaxed. And we have others too, like GABA. A lot of people have heard of GABA. And again, that is a very calming neurotransmitter. So when we have imbalances in these neurotransmitters, this is when things can go horribly wrong, or we're going to start to feel not so good. So like you say, chronic stress can cause down-regulation in these neurotransmitters. So we're just not functioning, we're not firing on all cylinders. And just to give you an example, so dopamine, for example, if dopamine becomes too high, so that's our reward center, then we can become agitated, we can become aggressive, we can become paranoid, and worst case, we can become psychotic. So, that's just one neurotransmitter out of balance that can cause such a huge difference in our mental response. And then if dopamine drops too low, so in other words, we downregulate it too much, then we've just got complete amotivation. We've got no joy, we see no purpose in life, and we become, again, we become mentally unbalanced in a different way just from that dysregulation. And then again, if you look at something like GABA, if you have too much GABA, you're just going to be asleep all the time. And if you have too much, and if you have no GABA, if you have no relaxation, you're going to be panicked, you're going to have panic attacks, you're going to feel anxious, you're going to feel fearful over everything. So you can see how nuanced these neurotransmitters are and how out of balance, easily out of balance they can become. Now, at one time, we now have the ability to test these neurotransmitters. And there's quite a good test that can be just tested through the urine. And that gives us a very, very good idea of whether, if somebody is suffering from anxiety, depression, PTSD, what is happening to their neurotransmitters, so that if a doctor decides to offer medication, or you decide to go down a more holistic, natural route to try and treat it, then you know actually what you're treating. Because sometimes you don't really know what your problem is, if you like. And like you say, in the old days, the doctors would just give you an SSRI, assuming you had low serotonin, Whereas actually they found low serotonin is actually not, it is common, it's not that common. It's not as common as low dopamine. And actually treating low serotonin when you've got low dopamine, you're treating the wrong thing. So it's very interesting, and it's good to have a sort of, get as much information as you can from testing. Okay. So you can say all that, and testing is a great thing. And I'm always ranting on about it, aren't I? Go get blood work and go and have this tested, because it definitely does give you a good idea as to where you're at. Having said that, you could have one person who's got low dopamine, they've had a massive stressful event, and they don't have the same response as somebody else. So you look at a piece of paperwork, two people, exactly the same blood work and responses. One is suffering hugely, and another person maybe not so much.
I was thinking that, because surely depending on when you would get tested, you could have potentially have gone through something quite life-changing or traumatic, and so you're potentially being tested at a time where those levels may have decreased, so it may not be a permanent change in those neurotransmitters.
No. I think the reality is that like we said, if you have too much of cortisol for too long, you may have a response that takes a long time to self-regulate back up, for example. So it might down-regulate for a long time. But, if you have like a short stressor, like you've been in hospital and you've had surgery, which is, relatively short stressor. Yes, if you test your neurotransmitters then and your hormones, they're going to be kind of all over the place. And somebody, like you say, the individual response of one person to that would be maybe different to another. And this is where we're not in full understanding as to why one person would become ill and another person recovers more easily, if you like. Okay. So this is when you look at something like genetics, and this is where genetics are, again, we're understanding an awful lot more. Now, please don't get me wrong, I'm not a genetic expert in any way, but I have seen lots of experts talking about genetics, and that's very interesting, because what they found is that some key genetic mutations, which are very common to 30, 40, 50% of us, will affect something like the way we detoxify adrenaline. So you and I could go out, we're in a car, we have like a bump in the car. I may have totally different genetics to you, whereas I don't detoxify my adrenaline well. So we know adrenaline, for example, detoxifies through the liver. Yeah. Due to maybe my genetic mutation, I don't detoxify that well. So I wake up the next morning and I'm still stressed. That adrenaline is still raging around my body from that stressor that I had in the day. Whereas you have had the same stressor as me, but maybe your genetics are different. You've been able to assimilate that adrenaline better, detoxify it. So the next day, you're able to take on board a little bit more stress. Whereas my stress bucket is already higher. So the next day, I encounter another bit of stress. Could be, I don't know, bad work day, or your husband's annoyed you, or your kids are driving you nuts. So again, you're producing adrenaline. Maybe you're still not just, detoxifying it well. So your stress bucket gets fuller a lot faster, or my stress bucket gets fuller a lot faster, let's say, than your stress bucket. And that's very, very individual. But it's interesting how we understand these genetics now and how that plays into it. And I think it's not that the genetics are going to say, oh yeah, that's great, I know now how to cure it. But knowing those genetics early on, you've got to pay more attention to your stress, because your stress is going to impact you perhaps more than another individual's stress, if that makes sense.
Definitely.
So I think, and we all know that, don't we? We all know that some people, and it's not through any fault of their own, they don't handle stress, or maybe they handle stress at one point of their life, but then it's, you know, it's those little, it's like chipping away, isn't it? And then you just get one extra stressor event, and then boom, you're into a full-blown potential, you know, major depressive disorder or a major anxiety situation. So
Zoe, there's a bit more information about the brain-gut connection. Is there anything that you can talk to us about that in more detail?
Yes. Well, yeah. Again, it's great that we've got so much more information now. So we were talking about, you know, some of the main neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin. And at one time, of course, in fact, up till fairly recently, we thought that it was all in the brain. So serotonin was in the brain and dopamine was in the brain. And although we kind of think there was always knowledge that serotonin was produced in the gut, there was always, or it was never proven, or wasn't able to be proven back then, that serotonin could actually cross the blood-brain barrier. So, you know, obviously we have neurotransmitters, hormones that are actually produced in all parts of the body, but the question then was, could it actually get into the brain? We know that dopamine, the main storage for dopamine is actually in the brain. But the main storage for serotonin, which is of course what everybody was taking with the SSRI drugs to increase serotonin, was actually stored more in the stomach. So, and like you say, they thought originally, well, that's pretty irrelevant because it doesn't cross the brain barrier, but it actually does. So they have now proven that it does. So serotonin, of course, is in the brain as well, but the main way it's produced is actually in the stomach. So, of course, then that goes into, well, it's important then that our stomach is as healthy as it can be. And, of course, like we discussed in lots of the previous videos, many things can impact that microbiome. So microbiomes being the microbes that live in the gut. And we have good and bad microbes. So, again, it's a balance. We need some good, we need some bad, but we don't want, you know, if it gets out of sync, then we've got gut problems. So yeah, many things impact it. So we need, like say, every day with our food to have some good raw, some cooked, and some hopefully fermented foods, because that gives us a nice range of microbes. And things that really impact it are things like, chemicals that we ingest. Oh, I've got my cat here now.
Oh, Casper.
I don't want to be in. You've got no mental health problems, so you can go over there. So yeah, I've lost my train of thought there. So yeah, lots of things can impact it. So you know things that we take, Nurofen, aspirin, any drug, fluoride in the water. Sweetness can have quite an adverse effect. So lots of people now are worried about the calories. So replace sugar with sweeteners, and what they found is that sweeteners have an impact on the microbiome. So all of these things are going to impact potentially our serotonin production in the gut, as well as other things. And then, of course, that can have a knock-on effect in terms of potentially our mental health by reducing serotonin levels. So, and obviously then stress impacts the gut, because, we know the more stressed we are, we don't absorb our nutrients. So we might be having a good diet, but are we absorbing our diet well? Because if we're not absorbing it well, then again, it's pointless eating all of these good foods. So yeah, many things impacting that then have a knock-on effect with the neurotransmitters.
So this might sound like a really silly question, but for anyone who may be thinking, how would you know if your body's absorbing certain nutrients or absorbing the food that you're feeding yourself?
Yeah, obviously when I see a client, that's one of the first things I go through. I go through every single vitamin and the impact of a reduction in those vitamins and the effects that it can have. And you know, if it's vitamin C, if it's low vitamin C, it'll produce X, and if it's low vitamin B1, it'll produce something else. If it's low iodine, it will. So I always go through that with my client. But apart from, you know, and sometimes it's really obvious. And when I discuss their diet, I can see the correlation between their symptoms and how they choose to eat, if that makes sense.
Okay.
But really, short of intracellular vitamin testing, which is not done at the doctor's, it's actually the vitamin inside the cell. It's actually quite hard to tell if somebody's is deficient. Yeah.
Or if they're not absorbing those vitamins properly.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you get a classic example of people who are poor iron absorbers, poor folate absorbers, poor B12 absorbers, and their diet looks relatively good. And that can be impacted by things like too much grain in the diet, because, you know, grain is very phytate rich, and minerals are bound to phytates. So if people have a very high carbohydrate loaded with grain, then you can see mineral and nutrient deficiencies because of that. So
okay, that makes sense.
Lots of different things really impact absorption. Yeah. But short of testing, you can't really determine. But like you say, some people come out with obvious, like for example, people who are low in B vitamins, we talk about that and the impact on stress. So the more stressed you are, the more you burn through your B vitamins, magnesium, even iron, and probably quite a lot of the minerals actually. So you could think, oh, I'm doing okay with those vitamins, but if you're under a high period of stress, then you need to maybe increase those vitamins a lot more to not be symptomatic.
Or lower your stress.
Yeah, or lower the stress, exactly. But you know, sometimes it's unavoidable, isn't it? You're sitting exams, you know, you're high period of stress, and you're burning through those vitamins very, very quickly, because, you know, the B vitamins are responsible really for the nervous system, modulating the nervous system. So, and a lot of people today are chronically low in B vitamins, and it can be just that. This is what I'm saying. You know, your mental health or your anxiety or your depression could be just you're burning through those vitamins too much. And we also have genetic connections to not being able to circulate those B vitamins properly. So genetics can impact that too.
Okay. So that's really interesting then, I guess, when you think about PTSD, I mean, my knowledge of it is really quite limited. But I suppose in terms of when you talk about PTSD, usually that kind of maybe anxiety, maybe depression can come on from a specific event or a specific series of events that have occurred. So, you know, often it's not just one thing that's happened. It's been a build-up of stress, and there may have been that final cherry on the top, or not so much of a cherry on the top that has gone away. And that's, you know, for someone who potentially may not have had any history of anxiety or depression, a series of things have happened in a really short space of time or a certain period of time.
Yeah, I think, you know, like you say, Dee, in terms of PTSD, it's usually a major event, obviously. You know, you see people who come back from war, or, you know, they've had a real severe trauma. But like you say, you also get people who come back from war who have had witnessed the same things. That's the, I suppose, interesting from a clinical perspective, I suppose, that somebody could have had exactly the same trauma, but not got the same clinical manifestation. But they may have something else. They may have heart attack, or, you know, the clinical manifestation of stress is interesting, and possibly, like you say, is under some maybe genetic control. Who knows? We just don't know how it all interplays, and it would be really wrong of me to make out that I know how it does interplay. And it just like with people, it's a bit similar to men, you know, like lowering testosterone in a man, where, you know, a man has very low testosterone, and that will kick off depression. And similarly in a woman, when she loses at menopause, instantly, you know, the first sign a lot of women have of that is depression. Now, if you look at people's testosterone and in a woman estradiol, they could be exactly the same, but the symptoms could be, in terms of neurological symptoms, could be completely different. And that's, again, a nuance that we are still not in full understanding of. Why lowering of hormone would trigger X in somebody and not in another. So it is very nuanced, and you can understand why a medical doctor, because a medical doctor at the end of the day is just trying to get you up and running quickly. And nobody really understands quite the nuance of how all of this interplays. So a doctor is going to be keen to treat your symptoms, because we all know that panic disorder can get worse very, very quickly. So if somebody has a panic attack, let's say in one situation, that can manifest very quickly in a panic attack in another. And then they almost get to the point where they're agoraphobic, and, you know, that escalates quickly, and a doctor's keen to get that under control. So, you know,
I have to say, one thing I find really interesting is, I think when you talk about stress as well, not you specifically, but just in general, is that it can really mean different things to different people. So, you know, there's people that I know that have had really chronic illnesses, but then in a conversation with other people, they've said, oh, well, you know, I'm gone through a breakup and this has happened and that has happened. Oh, but it's nothing compared to what you've been through. And that comparison I find really interesting, because like you just said, we all handle stress very differently, and whether that's genetics or whatever it could be, but it doesn't mean you have to have been through some life-changing illness to suffer potentially the same level of stress as somebody who may well have gone through something like that. So I think that is also really important to point out, that it's not a scale of, well, you've had it worse than me, so
no, it's not a competition.
Then, like justified. It's like, well, you know, why can't I be feeling that way if I've gone through something seemingly much smaller or, you know, lesser of an issue? Well,
no, absolutely. There is this. I mean, again, I guess to a certain extent we've all been quite ignorant. You know, it's not our fault. We've been quite ignorant about the cause of anxiety and depression, and the fact that there are so many pieces of the pie when we're looking at something like a mental health disorder. And we just don't know that, like, for example, I may have poor genetics, let's say, and I also may have poor hormones. And I also, let's say, at some point, then may have a poor lifestyle situation. Maybe I've split up with a boyfriend, or, you know, who knows, you know, you've lost somebody dear to you. So whereas one person may have just had the traumatic event without the genetics, the lifestyle, the poor diet, you know what I mean? So the impact of that stressful event on your overall system is, you cannot compare one person to another, because and I think it's good that we've got a bigger understanding now, so that we're more sympathetic, you know, because a lot of people say, oh, why can't you just get over it? You know, there's always that for somebody who has never had depression, never had anxiety, don't know what it feels like, you know, they must be.
But it's
really,
like, I guess maybe I should have said this at the beginning as well, that I think something that a lot of people forget too is that everybody has physical health. Anything can go wrong with your physical health at any time. You can get ill at any time, you can have an injury at any time, anything can happen to you at any time. That sounds really bad, but it's true. But it's the same with mental health. We all have mental health. And so I don't really believe anyone's, unless maybe you're a child, that you've never, ever, ever had any form of feeling low at any point. I mean, whether you've, you know, gone through teenage years,
extremely, maybe times, they don't have, you know, a genuine psychopath now who has they actually do not emote. They don't have emotion. It's part of the, you know, another.
Okay, well that's like a very extreme version of that.
Well, a psychopath isn't going to feel the same to you. think, because
No, I understand that. I meant just like, generally, like normal people.
they're normal people. But you know what I
Yeah.
mean? They're an extreme end,
Yeah.
and they probably don't suffer at all. But if you take them away, everybody suffers, and nobody's mental health, like their physical health, is constant.
Yeah, but I think we're only just starting to understand that actually, but people are still so scared. I think it's getting better, but I think people are still so scared to talk about their mental health. Like you could get two women together who will quite happily tell you all about their periods and their menopause and how hard it was giving birth and all the rest of it. But you dare to talk about your mental health, and it's like, oh God, no, can't talk about that.
Yeah.
So I think it's good that it is being talked about more. Sorry, I've just gone off on a tangent, but
and especially in the workplace, because I mean, it's good to see now that a lot of big corporations have got proper mental health, that people are feeling bad, that they have somewhere to go, they have somewhere that they're not going to be judged, they're not fearful that this is going to impact their job and their livelihood. And because a lot of people just sat there suffering for a long time in silence. And
but it's just, if you had a physical ailment of some description and you felt like you couldn't talk about that, like you can't even say, oh, my back's really hurting today, for example, it just, like, to me, it just seems quite ridiculous that, on the same level, you can't really, or you'd feel like you can't talk about your mental health. It's, what is the difference? Everybody has it. Everybody goes through ups and downs with both.
Exactly. I so agree with you, and I just think, thank goodness that some people in the public eye now have really taking it on. The royal members of the royal family have taken it on as a really good cause to highlight the fact that they've actually struggled too. This isn't it's not demographic dependent, it's not monetary dependent necessarily, it's unique to an individual. Like our own health, we have a unique blueprint based on many factors. I think the challenge is in treating it, properly, and hopefully now with better testing, that somebody is not just shoved on an antidepressant medication, that try a bit of this and try a bit of that and see if that works, and you end up on a cocktail of God knows what sometimes.
So what would I know you can't really give blanket advice to just a whole group of people, but what would your advice be to somebody who maybe has had ongoing episodes of anxiety, or it's just been a part of their life for so long, or depression?
I would say it's awful to say it, if you have the money, because unfortunately this is not available, this kind of testing. Hopefully it will be part of mainstream medicine, because it's better to know early on and know how to prevent, but it isn't at the moment. But it's not terribly expensive. You can have the urine organic acid testing, which tests your neurotransmitters. We all know you can have your hormones tested, get those checked. And then if you've had a history through the family, I would get the genetics checked again. Because we know what the genetics are now that contribute mainly to the mental health issues. Get those checked too. And it's like, because every piece of the pie that you can formulate for yourself will help in your individual treatment. And then obviously, of course, diet, lifestyle, sleep, but that if you have those things that you're susceptible to, that you have to pay more attention than maybe somebody else.
Yeah, because there is obviously a lot of information out there as well about improving certain factors in your life can increase things like serotonin and also dopamine as well. I'm not sure which one is which in terms of diet and exercise, and obviously your sleep and things like that, but I'm guessing it must also be a bit of a catch-22 situation, because like in any circumstance, if somebody's feeling shit, like I know when I feel like shit, I don't eat great. And especially with people that suffer from anxiety, if you don't feel great and you feel anxious, you don't want to go outside, you don't want to meet up with people, you don't want to do all those things that could actually help that. So it is a real catch-22 situation.
It really is. And, you know, somebody with chronic depression, it's easy to say, oh, make sure you're, you know, for me, well, make sure you're eating properly, your omega-3 fatty acids. And you're going, well, I'm too tired to even get out of bed.
And I think touching on what you said earlier as well about how sometimes people can just be like, well, just snap out of it. I think that's also, it's probably like a whole nother topic of conversation in dealing with and helping anyone that you maybe live with or partners, or just understanding a lot of those factors as well.
I really hope now that, you know, I mean, you know, 10 years ago when I had, 20 years ago, 30 years ago now, when I first had hormonal problems, the doctors didn't know anything. We're so lucky now that we've got this information. And let's hope this forms part of children's early education. You know, we're not all the same. It just raises more awareness for ourselves and for our friends and peers who have a different makeup. We all have a different makeup. You know, education, like you say, I mean, they're talking now about educating in the menopause. It's a good thing, you know, so that there's not the sort of ignorance that there was back when I was 20 and I had hormone problems and they were like, I've no idea what's wrong with you, you know.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I don't know if many people know this, but the highest rate of suicide in women is menopausal age. So there's obviously a clear correlation there between hormones and feeling suicidal.
Yes.
But even like I had cancer when I was 30, which you obviously know. But even getting any kind of support for PTSD after something like that, it's non-existent. So I mean, it's getting better. It is getting better, but I think those issues have to be really identified and communicated back to the relevant bodies for things to start changing and for people to start talking about them more.
Yeah, I so agree with you. It's the area that sadly there's a lack of support for people, like you say, who've been through a physical illness that then, like you say, like yourself, Dee, that then manifests in a stress response that, you know, can be as I've heard people who've been through cancer treatment who say to me, the depression was worse than having cancer. That was harder to get over. So, you know, and like
very strange. I think it's, you know, on one hand you're like, oh, I'm so lucky to be over this and to have gotten through it when so many people don't.
Yes.
But then there's a whole, you know, everybody's like, oh, you look so well, your hair's growing back, and which is great. It's obviously, you know, it's great when you've lost all your hair and when you've been through all these shitty side effects. But then there's that guilt that comes with it, which I think more people are becoming aware of it now. But I think everyone's like, oh, you know, you've got your life back, and there is that gratitude, but then there's this whole other, like you just said, mental side to it, where you're like, oh, okay, I should be feeling like this, but I'm not. So it's
and like you say, there is a lack of. I mean, you know, we've got a wonderful NHS system, you know, but you know, perhaps in a sort of preventative way, and then, like you say, if you get a physical illness and then it manifests in a more of a stressed mental health illness, then there's definitely sort of gaps here where it would be great to have more and quicker. I think it's not the fact it's not there, but I remember once when I lost one of my best friends and I was feeling pretty low. And I went to the doctor and I sort of burst into tears. I didn't even think there was anything wrong with me. And she said, oh, I'll send you to a counsellor. Which was great. She didn't say, oh, here's a pill for an antidepressant.
Yeah.
But, you know, she said, I'll send you to a counsellor. Well, it was 6 months when that counselling appointment came through. That's no good. I was fine by then. I'd recovered, you know.
I think when you get to that point, you need immediate help, don't you? It's not,
immediate, exactly.
Let's just sit here and wait for another 6 months. And that's that's not anything against the NHS at all, but I think what's great now is seeing
this budget, do they? Let's face it.
Yeah, but there's so many groups setting up now. Like there's so many groups set up for helping women who are going through the menopause, and even women who are going through that because they've had to have surgery, or they may be younger than the normal average age. There's a lot of groups that are being set up for cancer support, because there's only so much the NHS can do.
Yes.
So that is great to see. But I guess, again, it's up to the individual as well, the whole catch-22 thing here, but to seek out some of those groups for that support.
Yeah. It's like you say, it's a very complex area. I hope I haven't pretended to feel in this video that I have the answers. The purpose of this video is really to give an overview as to all of the different areas that could impact, really. And people may, listening to the video, think, oh yes, actually I haven't had a stressful event. I wonder if mine is a genetic problem. Because I do feel, if I do feel stressed, I don't seem to get over that stress, and I feel stressed again the next day. And, you know, that may trigger thinking, oh, okay, I wonder if I have, poor genetics in terms of...
it is, like you just said, it is such a complex issue. There's no way we can even scratch the surface with like a 30-minute video. But hopefully and even for anyone who's watching that's not even really spoken to a friend or family member, maybe it might start that conversation. It might start a Google search for that person.
Exactly.
It could start some form of investigation, I guess.
Yes. And like you say, in terms of the symptoms, like you say, from a holistic perspective, you can obviously make sure, if you're in a position to, that you're eating well, trying to get a little bit of light exercise even initially, even if it's, you don't feel like it, but you've got to push yourself and it's just 10 minutes out in the fresh air. A bit of
definitely
yoga.
Small, achievable
steps. Yeah, exactly. And if you're really feeling that poorly, try and get a family member who can cook you a nice meal if you're not feeling up to it, who can just get you through that phase where you can, because the body does naturally try and pick itself up. The body's super clever. But for some
I have
people,
to say as well, I think
family support or support of somebody, then it's very challenging.
Yeah, I think it's difficult, because I think if you're the person going through that, it's very hard to ask for help.
Yes.
So again, it's the catch-22 thing, isn't it? It's very hard to ask for help.
Vulnerable, do they?
Yeah.
I mean, who likes being weak and vulnerable?
Yeah, but I think, I had this when I was going through chemo, and again, I didn't really want to ask people for help, because I've gotten a lot better at it now, but I was really, really bad even before I got sick. And I think, the friends and family that I had in that scenario had to just literally force themselves on me and say, right, I'm doing this. I'm not even going to ask you, I'm just doing it. And I think, it's up to the people, maybe to some extent around others that need that help, to just force the help if you have to. The person that's living that potentially day to day, it is very, very hard to reach out and ask for that help. So
yeah, but like you say, I think people are often reluctant to go to the doctor because they feel, they're just going to stick me on but if you're not happy, get a second opinion, get proper counselling if you can. Honestly, I'm not against medication in this kind of a way. I personally think if you're having severe PTSD, severe anxiety, that can be so life disabling that sometimes, even if it's a short course of an anti-anxiety treatment or a short course of medication, that can just get you over, so you don't spiral even worse. I think
and definitely if you've got a chemical imbalance of a certain hormone or neurotransmitter, it makes sense.
Yes, because it's not an easy fix just by going to the gym for 20 minutes necessarily, but and I'm not advocating medication, but I do think it has its place, and you know, I think in terms of medical advice, go to somebody who you feel very confident in, that's giving you the right advice. And if you're not happy with your GP, then ask for a second opinion.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Yeah. And like you say, there is support services out there. So hopefully we can leave a few at the bottom of the video.
Yeah, definitely. I'll share some even free counselling services, free resources that people can reach out to, because especially talking to someone who is, you know, a trained, qualified professional, it's not financially not accessible to so many people. So as much free information and help that anyone can get is definitely a good start.
Yeah, exactly. And even women, you know, or men going through the andropause, or women going through the menopause, you know, sometimes a short, you know, if you are severely depressed as a result of that and unable to function, then sometimes just getting through that perimenopause, once you're into menopause, or once, you know, you feel okay, it stabilizes, but you just need something to help you through that. And don't feel ashamed, you know, we're all different, and some people don't feel ashamed if you need to resort to medication. That's what I feel.
Yeah.
So I am an advocate of, obviously, lifestyle, diet, nutrition, that's my bag. I think this is an area where you shouldn't feel ashamed. And if you feel better on a little bit of medication, good for you, you know.
I've got to say, when what you just said there as well, actually, that Facebook, love it or hate it, there are actually quite a few really good groups for certain things that I've been through with my health. And you know, your friends and family, as helpful as they can be, they're not always going to understand certain, you know, if you've been through a certain health issue or whatever. And I was actually, when I had cancer, I was so reluctant to join anything that had anything to do with the words cancer support, because I just thought, oh, it's just going to be a bunch of people sitting here complaining about how ill they feel. And I had such a negative, you know, oh, I'm dying. And it's like, well, you might be, but, you know, whatever. So I was so against it. And I don't know what made me change my mind, but I joined a couple of groups. I think the first one I actually went to was the Maggie Centre in London, and I was really wary about going. I was so like, oh God, I don't want to be, this is going to sound awful, but I do not want to be surrounded by more people who've got the same problem as I have.
As I've got.
I don't want to do this. So anyway, I bit the bullet. I don't know how or why, but I did, and it made such a huge difference. I thought, you know, for the first 15 minutes, obviously you connect with people and you go, oh, this is a surgery that I've had, and this is the doctor that I saw. So you do have those points of common ground, but then it just moves back to, okay, where do you live? What do you do for a job? And who are you? And all the rest of it. So for anyone who's hesitant to kind of get, you know, if you can't afford to go and see a counsellor, or if you just don't like the pressure of that one-on-one interaction, because you're like, this is just too much, I don't want to sit here talking to somebody about my problems, those groups, I would say, are a really, really good starting point, because A, they're free, they're accessible to anybody, and you will meet lots of people that will really understand you, but it will go beyond that. You're not then gonna, like, you know, I thought I was just going to be sat there talking about cancer for a year, and even though I was going through it, I didn't want to sit there talking about it, and that's actually not what happened at all. And I joined a couple of other groups, and ultimately those people really understood what I was going through firsthand. It wasn't just, you know, oh, you know, my dad had that, and it's like, okay, that, I'm really sorry to hear that, but that doesn't really, in a very selfish way, this information doesn't really help me. So actually it really changed my mind about those things. So really invaluable. If you can get on Facebook and search for any of, you know, whatever dynamic you fit into, I'd say has helped me massively.
I totally agree with you. I think the only danger with some of the self-help groups is just you using that instead of taking medical advice. You know, I'm a big advocate of, you know, I know there's some GPs that are better than others, we all know that, but I'm still a big advocate in not saying, oh, this worked for me, and you know, and making assumptions. I think that's the word.
Yeah, definitely. I think you do have to be very careful, and I think if a group is managed well, the admins will say that nobody in here is allowed to give medical information, and obviously you have to understand that what works for one person isn't necessarily going to work for you. I think sorry, I didn't make that very clear. I think I mean more in terms of support network.
Yes, I know. Yes, emotional.
So I think it's a good addition to something like that. Yeah, and but I think it's also probably a good entry point, because if you are thinking about maybe going and seeing a counsellor, but you're a little bit scared of just going from, you know, just going straight into that, then it is probably a bit of an eye-opener, really, because then you kind of, you know, when you're going through something like that, you sometimes think, I'm the only one in the world, and then you meet a million other people. Actually, I'm not the only one in the world, and it does.
Well, exactly. We all think that our, you know, medical conditions are unique, don't we? And, you know, like you say, that's when, you know, as with the best will in the world, family want to support you, friends want to support you, but if they have not had what you've had, they can't really totally understand you. So it's a huge benefit to talk to somebody else who has been through what you have been through, I think. And like you say, they are hugely beneficial, and there's lots and lots of support groups now. But I do think, you know, still, if you can, try and get to the root cause, try and work out what it may be for you.
Thanks, Zoe, for joining us again. That concludes part 4 in this 4-part series. If you haven't watched parts 1, 2, and 3, Zoe goes into much more detail when it comes to diet, hair loss, and sex drive, specifically with male hormones. And part 1 covers the basics of hormones. Thanks again for watching.